Good evening. We're excited to have you join us for a conversation with Dr. Jennifer Harvey. She's author of the New York Times bestseller, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. I'm John Edwards, and I'll serve as your moderator this evening. Dr. Harvey will start the program by talking about her book and how best to have discussions with children about race and racism, as well as other issues the topic invokes. As her talk prompts questions, please email them to libraryprogramquestions@gmail.com. And that email should be displayed on the chat section on Zoom. Those questions we will compile as she speaks, and then we'll hold them until she finishes her presentation. Then in the Q&A, we'll get to as many of them as we can by 8 o'clock, along with those that were submitted in advance. That email is libraryprogramquestions, one word, @gmail.com. The hosts for tonight's program are the Des Moines Public Library, West Des Moines Public Library, Clive Public Library, and Beaverdale Books. Beaverdale Books has signed copies of Dr. Harvey's book, with a portion of the proceeds supporting urban dreams. Support for the program also comes from friends of the Forest Avenue Library and viewers like you. Before we turn the mic over to Dr. Harvey, let me give you a bit of her background. At Drake University, she's a professor of religion and serves as faculty director for the Cru Scholars Program, which helps build community for our students of color. She earned her PhD in Christian ethics from Union Theological Seminary. The primary focus of her work is racial justice and white anti-racism. Her earlier book, Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation, has received critical acclaim. Dr. Harvey has written for the New York Times, CNN, and countless other publications, and is a widely sought public speaker. She has appeared on nationally syndicated television programs, ranging from Good Morning America to CNN's Town Hall with Sesame Street, and is a frequent guest on radio, including appearances on NPR's All Things Considered, and It's Been a Minute with Sam Sanders. And just today, CNN posted her article, The Conversation White Parents Need to Have with their kids after Kenosha. If you go to CNN.com and search for Jennifer Harvey, you'll see that article at the top, as well as others she has written. They are all very thought-provoking and well worth your time, and I think she'll probably make mention of them this evening. After the next 90 minutes, I think you'll have an even better idea why our speaker's insights are so timely in light of the issues we face today. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer Harvey to our program. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, John. It's an honor to be with you all tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. And I want to thank all the partners for supporting this event, but especially the librarians who first reached out to me and did so much heavy lifting to invite this conversation into existence, and especially in our community in the Des Moines metropolitan area. I'm glad to be with you. So I want to start our time this evening by sharing some stories. And I think these stories help us describe and map some of the terrain that we need to find our footing on right now in the nation if we want a different future than the present we are currently wading through together. And the first story I'll offer up came to me. This is a direct quote from a parent in Des Moines. And this parent said this: I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I'd worried about what she'd be taught, like I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when she came home, she was so excited about everything she'd learned and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter looked at me and she said, "You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white." And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So if we imagine for a moment this child had been Latina and she'd come home after a day at school celebrating a Latina justice leader and she said, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Latinas," I don't think her mother's first response would have been an angst-ridden, "Oh my goodness, oh no." And very likely, Black children in that actual second grade class did go home and say things like, "You know what, Dad? I'm so glad we are Black." And I can imagine many a father's response being, "Indeed, we are glad we're Black." But the landscape, the racial landscape, is just fundamentally different for parents of white children. Because here's the thing, if you are committed to equity, if you value justice, but you also live in an unjust society that at the very same time privileges you in that injustice, you do face some very real conundrums. Conundrums that show up in a statement like, "Mom, I'm so glad we're white." Oh my God, do we say that? So these conundrums impact white children's development from their very earliest of days. Of course, race impacts all children's development. And all of our children need support if they're going to navigate a society that is both very diverse and deeply unjust. But we also know that children of color, parents of children of color tend to offer that support. So we know from studies that parents of kids of color teach their children explicitly about the ways that race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white parents. But in contrast, we also know from studies that 75% of white families with kindergartners, quote, never or almost never talk about race with theirs. That is a lot of white silence, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. We're going to talk a little bit about what white silence looks like, about why it's so dangerous, what it yields, and then most importantly, about what some of the counter responses look like. So I suspect a lot of you probably saw the story that ran, I think it was spring of 2017, and it was about these 2 4-year-old boys. They were best friends. One of them was Black, one of them was white. They were so sweet. And these 2 4-year-olds got matching haircuts because they wanted to see if their teacher could tell them apart. And the story got so much attention, I think, because their friendship was so beautiful. And I think in a way it actually tapped into a yearning lots of us have around interracial friendship. But it also got attention, I began to realize, kind of early in the news cycle, because it seemed to endorse white silence as a good parenting strategy. So the story seemed to show that, first of all, kids can be taught not to see color. And then second of all, that when they can, that's a win. I actually heard the white boy's mother interviewed, and she told media that his, quote, inability to see difference was a parental success because, she said, "I just taught him to love everyone the same." Love everyone the same. Underneath our skin, we all bleed red blood. Everybody's equal, no matter what we look like. All of these words are really, really nice. They sound really nice, and they do contain values that I hold on to in terms of what they're trying to teach. But we actually need to recognize that these are all versions of so-called colorblind teaching, which actually we should start to call white silence, because that's what it is. They're actually the epitome of white silence. And it's in fact mostly true that it's really just white Americans that tend to use that kind of language to talk about race and difference. And the problem is, as tempting as so-called colorblindness is, even when it shows up as everybody's equal or underneath our skin, we're all the same, as tempting as it is, these strategies for teaching kids to value one another backfire, and they backfire mightily. And we know this too from lots of studies. So there was a study of 100 white families, and it was done quite some time ago in 2006. And these families said that their approach to race was to teach their kids that, quote, everybody's equal. So researchers asked these kids, when they were not in a room with their parents, a very blunt question. And here was the question: do your parents like Black people? 38% of white kids being raised in these everybody's equal families said, I don't know. And 14% of those children said, nope, my parents don't like Black people. It turns out we're all equal is literally so abstract that kids have no idea what it means. They have no idea they're supposed to connect that to actually valuing people, whatever our skin tones, hair textures, accents, names. More troubling, this teaching does literally nothing to counteract racism among children. Now, before I talk a little bit about some of the specific dangers of white silence, I want to say that very specifically, this is not just a parenting problem, because a ton of adults are involved when it comes to raising kids: teachers, clergy, coaches, librarians, neighbors, grocery store clerks. If you've seen a kid, if a kid has seen you, you have helped raise that child. It's a generational work. And it's also true, this is not just about white kids, because the truth is, what adults are and are not able to say to children about race and anti-racism actually has everything to do with where we, the adults, are in our own abilities. And finally, this is not just about white kids. White silence impacts kids of color and eventually teenagers, 20-somethings, professionals and colleagues who come into contact with white kids and eventually teenagers and 20-somethings and pre-professionals and colleagues. So this is a multiracial conversation because we are all impacted by how white kids are being raised in the United States. Okay, so why is white silence so dangerous? What happens? I want to take two passes at this. One comes from like the younger age set, and one is like a teenager kind of example. Here's the younger kid example. We know from countless studies that children internalize racist perceptions of themselves and others by the ages of 3 and 4. And this is all kids, not just white kids. And by the age of 5, all children are starting to recognize that different racial groups are treated differently and understand something about racial social status. And also by the age of 5, mostly kids know they're not really supposed to talk about this in front of adults. So there was a study that was done on preschoolers, and the researcher found over and over again, kids would play with larger social messages about race, messages most adults assume are going right over kids' heads. And in fact, when they would do this, they would play with race in ways that were sometimes they'd be mean to each other using race, all kids, not just white kids. But then if someone finally went to tell like that this was happening, oh, so-and-so wouldn't share the swing, they would like strip the racial language from the telling of what had happened because they knew the race part was going to get them in trouble. So one example of this really stood out to me. And now I'm using the researcher's language to describe what happened. She writes, there's a white girl pulling 2 other girls, one white, one Asian, in a wagon. The wagon gets stuck and the Asian girl jumps out to help. The white girl responds, no, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task, end quote. So this is a 4-year-old. And this 4-year-old is using white racial assumptions about who is American or not in her play. And she's doing it in a really sophisticated way. This was a study long before the immigration public conversations that are roiling through our discourse now was taking place. I can only imagine how this scene would happen now. And when you hear a story like this, if you're anything like me, you might find yourself tempted to go, well, oh my goodness, what are they teaching that child at home? That's the kind of thing I used to say before I was a parent, like I was a really good parent before I actually became a parent. I'm gonna urge all of us to resist that temptation. It's possible that is what's going on at home, maybe, but it's just as possible that that is not what's happening at home, because that's not how this really works. Adults, we like to think that when kids display racism, that the cause is a few bad rogue parenting apples. But we have got to understand that racism is like smog. And that metaphor, racism is like smog, is Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's metaphor. It's not mine. Dr. Tatum says, we're all breathing smog in every day. And so the thing is, if the problem is smog, white silence is just as likely to result in this kind of wagon story as is a child getting specific messaging at home that says only white people can be American. Because white silence is basically the decision to not give your 4-year-old a breathing mask and then sending her out into the world where the air is toxic. So your 4-year-old goes out in the world and she just breathes racism in. And in this case, that's negative stereotypes about people of color and false beliefs, if you're a white kid, about your own superiority. And then she breathes it right back out into the world. Smog is that powerful. And I know smog is real. My kids, I have 2 young kids, they have 2 moms. Neither my partner or myself is particularly wed to stereotypical notions of gender, but I could tell you plenty of stories about my children making sexist statements, things I know they didn't get from me. And I like to tell the story when my favorite nightmare was when my older child was 4, and she announced proudly, after chitter-chattering about God a lot, and using he language, and I'm a feminist and a religious studies scholar. And so one day I just said, H, how do you know God's a he? And first she said, well, Mama, God is a boy's name, which I thought was funny because I didn't know she knew Hebrew. And then my 4-year-old daughter looked at me and said, anyway, Mama, God must be a boy because boys are better than girls. Hashtag feminist religious studies scholar mom fail. And to date, the longest Facebook therapy session of my life. And we're not even silent about gender and sexism at our home. But if my kid had been out in the world, they would have been like, someone, if my child had said that, someone overhearing her might have said, oh, what are those 2 moms teaching that child at home, right? See how that doesn't even make sense? Another reason that silence is so dangerous is that kids notice everything. Who's here in this space? Who's absent? Who's doing what work? Who's in charge? Who's never in charge? And if you're living in a deeply segregated and completely hierarchical society, as all of us are, that alone has an impact. Kids will interpret the answers for themselves. No adult help needed. So if they don't see any Black folks in leadership roles, oh, they conclude, Black people must not be able to be leaders. If they see Latino, Latina, Latinx people primarily in service or custodial work, oh, Latino communities must mostly not be teachers, aren't doctors. And adults don't even realize this is happening. All we need is white silence, and our kids will create their own explanations, helped along by the larger racist culture, that smog, about why the world is the way it is. So here's the teenager description. Another researcher, Mary Buckhold, spent a year doing interviews in a racially diverse high school in Northern California. It was a pretty liberal place. They were doing a multicultural curriculum. They were trying to teach tolerance, diversity, all of that good stuff. And Buchholz started each of her interviews by asking students, and she interviewed multiracial groups of students. She would ask students their age, their sex, gender, their grade, and their race or ethnicity. Pretty straightforward stuff. Something fascinating happened. White students couldn't answer the last part of the question. They did fine with age, sex, gender, grade, but they would start squirming at the race ethnicity part. Some of them would give ironic answers, she reported. She wrote of one boy who was talking to her, and then all of a sudden he abruptly took on a fake British accent and says, "I'm the whitest of the white boys." It's kind of awkward. It's kind of mock celebrating his whiteness. But other students would play ignorant or get uncomfortable. So they would say things like, "Well, I'm white. No, you know what? Actually, I'm Dutch. That's right. My mom told me we're Dutch." Or they'd say things like, "I don't know. I'm white." The kids of color in the school have no trouble with the race ethnicity question. So as Buchholz pushes on this, she discovers two very important things. First of all, she discovers that these young people are literally not sure whether saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be this. So they kind of recoil from the white part. The other thing going on is that they associate whiteness with, quote, cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. Actually, all the young people do, not just the white kids. And sometimes this is told to her as kind of a joke, but other times it's very clear, it's incredibly painful. And this here is really, really important. We need to imagine we're at an age where uncool is about the worst thing you can be. Can you remember that time in your life? You're being told that celebrating diversity is a key value, as we should tell our young people. But everybody knows that you're not really supposed to celebrate your diversity, your whiteness. We don't do that. So here's the equation. You cannot embrace your race. Everyone else gets to embrace theirs. And you're supposed to enjoy embracing your much cooler peers' difference all the while. I don't know what we think is going to happen with a setup like that. But Buchholz quickly discovers that what happens is lots of these white kids are really resentful. They start to resent the whole enterprise of diversity, and they turn hostile, some of them, in part because they're jealous, not to the adults who have not equipped and supported them in an anti-racism conversation, helped them contend with their whiteness. They turn their hostility on students of color in the school. And so everybody's been set up to fail in this scenario. And this was before 2016. And so it couldn't be more serious that we break silence right now. Because last year or the year before on Drake's campus where I teach, we woke up one day and there were signs all over campus, papers that said, "It's okay to be white." And we now know there are elements recruiting on that kind of language because they know this vortex for some white youth is there. And I deeply believe we've got to fight for those youth and pull them into a different vision of our future in America. And we can't do that if we don't break silence. So this is urgent, but it's also long-term, this work of raising a generation of anti-racist white kids. And it starts with breaking silence. So the last bit of my time, I want to talk about a few ways breaking silence might look. And then we have time to talk together about our strategies, because the truth is in America, it has not happened yet that we've raised a generation of explicitly anti-racist white children and youth. And so this is new for white Americans. So what does it look like to break silence? First, we need to create race and justice conscious schemas. And I'll explain this through analogy. As I already told you, my two children have always known that families can have two moms. The moment they experienced mom, they knew you could have more than one. So even when dominant culture says to them things like, two girls can't get married, or you have to have a mom and a dad, when my children hear those messages, they experience those messages as strange. To them, those messages are the outliers that deserve or need some sort of explanation. It never occurs to my children that they are the outliers whose family has to be explained. And that's what schemas are. They're the underlying patterns that we use to make up our sense of normal, to make up the world. They knit together our deepest assumptions about how things just are. For my kids, multiple moms is just how it is. And we've got to make talking about race, naming injustice, and the truth that people are acting against racism all the time part of white kids' most basic schema. So I'm going to say that again. We've got to make talking about race, naming injustice, in other words, racism, and the truth that people are constantly taking action against racism. We've got to make those three things part of white kids' most basic schemas. There's a lot of ways to do that. Early and often, race talk is essential. Explicit teaching about racism. Some of the most important things to do are to get our kids in spaces where people are actively resisting racism. So our youngest of children start to know that the most normal, human, good thing to do for all of us to do, including white people, when they hear or see or encounter racism, is to challenge it. The most normal thing to do when it's there is to challenge it. I know all my kids ever question, should I interrupt racism? Always, yes. White silence waits until we have perfect words. It waits until our kids are ready. I don't know what that means. And then we try and explain racism. But for lots of our kids, it's too little and too late, because once our kids have built a schema that exists somewhere along the continuum of colorblind, so-called, which doesn't really exist, to explicitly racist beliefs, then we've got a heck of a lot more dismantling to do to even start to proactively talk about what we talk about. And also by then, they're so behind their peers of color in their anti-racism skill set, it's just not fair to them. They've got so much catching up to do, and we don't need to leave them on their own to catch up. Secondly, racial scripts are powerful. And this, when I say scripts, I mean like a play, when you write a script for a play. So I've heard so many parents of white kids talk about putting their kids in diverse spaces because we value diversity, lots of us, only to be sad and disappointed that our kids cannot sustain friendships across racial lines. And one of the things we all have to come to terms with is that whatever our unique personalities, commitments, identities, all of our lives are unfolding in a larger racial story. And this story began long before any of us did. And it's also getting rewritten on a collective level every single day, oftentimes in a way we would not individually endorse. And so what happens is I've been handed a role, and it doesn't matter who I am. The day after another Black person is killed by police and the footage goes viral, it doesn't matter that I did anti-police brutality organizing in New York City in the 90s. When I pass an African-American person on the sidewalk in Des Moines, Iowa, where I live, who doesn't know me, to them, I'm just another white person. Our national racial wounds, all of the violence and the trauma literally exist in the air between us. Those things mediate all of our initial encounters and often prevent more than a first encounter. Racial scripts are about our collective relationships, and they are operative in our children's lives too. We shouldn't expect them to be immune. Again, that's not a fair expectation. And so, for example, if my white daughter is only ever taught that police are safe, just go find one if you're in trouble, her relationship with her Black cousin, who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, her relationship's going to be impacted. They can cousin love each other all they want at this age, which they do, but over time, the depth of their friendship will erode. They will not be able to sustain an authentic connection. That's how the script will play out. Here's a funny story about racial scripts. I think it's funny. My other nephew, who's also African-American, attends at a racially diverse school here in Des Moines. And when my nephew, was 5, he's a very, very bright, hilariously funny child, bold, the kind of child who, if there's a subtext in the room and the adults don't want to talk about it because it's awkward, right? He's the kid that can say, hey, there's an elephant in the room, and make all the adults squirm without ever actually saying what the elephant is. He's brilliant. Very, very bold. So one night at family dinner, he was talking about, when he was 5, playing dodgeball at school that day. And he announced to the adults at the table, guess what? We're not supposed to say black kids against the white kids. And we laughed because, of course, this meant he had done that at school that day. But then when we asked him if he knew why his teachers didn't want him to say that, he was like, nope, they just said, don't say that. So I suspect that in the mix was some developmental naivete there, that there was an emerging kid awareness of racial tension in the school, and he was playing with it. And I was sad that the teachers hadn't felt equipped to explore this, not only with him, but with all of the kids who heard this exchange, because in fact, the silence that they left those children with left them more likely to succumb to racial scripts. Those kids are going to square off as black and white in some other way. They've already been handed roles, and at age 5, they're starting to know that. So I tried to imagine when this happened, any number of questions that might have interrupted the script, like, well, that's an interesting idea. What made you think of that? Or what about white kids and black kids who are friends? Would you allow them to play on their friend's team if they wanted to? That'd be an interesting conversation. Or, but how do we know who's white and who's black? What about kids who have families that are white and black? What about students who are Latino or Latina, Latinx, or from Vietnam? Do they get to play? Whose team would they play on? Or, that's interesting. Where else have you seen people divided up and going against each other like that? Does that happen in Des Moines? Does it happen at our school? And I can almost guarantee you that last set of questions would have brought out fascinating things that all of those kids are observing in their school, things that teachers typically don't get to hear about. So I want to be really clear. I am not suggesting these kiddos should have been allowed to play racially divided dodgeball. I don't think that's a good idea. But this is an example of a prime opportunity for exploratory dialogue, race and justice conscious conversation with kids. But what it takes is adults to stop underestimating our children, and quite frankly, ourselves to stop freaking out. 2 more stories. Third, race is in our bodies. This is another actual story from this actual mom and my actual white kid. I was at Chuck E. Cheese in West Des Moines. Many of you probably know that bastion of hell we call Chuck E. Cheese as adults, but which kids think is nirvana. And there was a mostly white crowd there. My kid was there for a birthday party. My child was 4. But in this mostly white, very crowded Chuck E. Cheese, there was also a large group of young African-American children running around, enjoying themselves immensely. And before long in this space, though nothing was ever spoken about it, I could feel racial dynamics in that space. What I noticed was white adults giving these quick glances towards these children and the African-American children. They weren't explicitly hostile glances, but there was definitely a vibe to them. And I also noticed there was a pronounced unnatural physical avoidance of these kids by white adults and an avoidance of eye contact. And this was especially strange because the space was so packed, we were negotiating our bodies in small space. And so like if 5 of us try and walk through a doorway at the same time, the first thing we're gonna do to try and avoid bumping into each other is eye contact, right? It's not even gonna be words, we're gonna look at each other. No eye contact happening on the part of these white adults to these young black children. It was like we were in racial bubbles. So at one point I stepped up to help my child play a game. And just at the same moment, a boy who was probably about 9, who was part of these group of children, stepped up to play. He didn't look at either of us, which was consistent with the dynamic that had been created in the space. But we were going to have to figure out who was playing first. And this child happened to have these incredible, just beautiful designs shaved into his hair. And I stopped him. I wasn't really thinking about it. I wasn't writing this book at the time. And I just said, "Hey, I love your haircut." And for a moment, he looked a bit startled. And then he, had a big smile and he said, "Thanks." And then we all made eye contact and smiled at each other and everything was fine. And we went on our merry way. But then what happened was, for the next hour, this child and the kids he was with chased my 4-year-old around Chuck E. Cheese. And they kept coming up to my 4-year-old over and over, shoving tickets in E's hands every time they won a game. And it was so sweet because E was so much younger than they were. And so Emery was just beaming from the generosity these older kids were showing. And E walked away with more tickets than they could have ever envisioned in Emery's wildest dreams, ever. Like, oh my gosh, all this, stuff to turn in for the landfill plastic at the end of the day. My child was elated. This was the only interracial interaction I saw at Chuck E. Cheese the entire time we were there. And I share this because this illustrates something that's hard to talk about, but it has to do with race being a body thing. Our bodies literally create racial and interracial dynamics when we are in shared space. Without words, the ways our bodies relate can increase or reduce racial tensions, increase or reduce connections and engagement. We can be in integrated space and be completely segregated depending on what we do with our bodies. I was thinking about none of that at Chuck E. Cheese that day. I didn't have any theories behind this yet. I did some reading later to try and figure it out. And I don't know for sure, but I do know there would have been no way to talk with my 5-year-old at the time about exactly what was happening, but that my child was actively internalizing those racial dynamics, those divides that all of us were enacting that day. But then, because of a 9-year-old's generosity, my child both experienced and participated in the disruption of embodied racial division. And even though my child has no conscious memory of that experience, I know that had impact on the feel of my child's body in a developmentally significant way. Now it will go away, it's a one-time experience, but this is an example of space. And the strategies that might emerge here have to do with being intentional about our bodies and about what our kids experience and what they do and what they see us do, and over and over and over again. So I'm going to close with the last story, the hardest story for me, that has to do with the learning that we have to be willing to break white kids' hearts. And of course, this is the hardest one for me because I'm a mom. But about 2.5 years ago now, I was having a conversation with another mother, and we were lamenting the nation's racial climate, which has only gotten more difficult since. And this mother nodded at her young white child and said to me, "I'm just so grateful she doesn't have to worry about any of this yet." And I totally got what she meant. I am longing to protect my children. We are living in violent, difficult times. And like all parents, I want my children to have hope about the world and about its possibilities. But it's also true, my friends, that there's nothing innocent about white innocence, even at age 4, at age 6. And the truth is that in the face of racial injustice, if we choose to keep white kids innocent, we are literally bartering away their humanity. And that I will not do. I learned this most deeply in fall of 2016, when within a period of 2 weeks, Terrence Cruncher and Keith Lamont Scott were both shot and killed by police. And students at Drake organized a protest. And I said to my children, remember when we talked about the men who were killed by police? Well, my students are going to come together and protest and make clear they want this to stop. And so I'm going, and I'll take you with me if you want to go. And both of my kids said, yes, we want to go. Can we make signs? And I said, sure. what are your signs going to say? And in unison, they said, Black Lives Matter. So I said, sure, you can make those signs. So I've taken my children to protest their whole lives, but by now they were old enough to be more fully engaged and even to chant, and they had more of a sense of what was going on. We've scaffolded this in and been cautious and careful as we've taught them about the realities of the world. By then they could participate with vigor. They spent nearly an hour physically present with Black and Latinx people and Asian American people and other people of color and a few white people who were just standing together to say, no, no more. And they saw young people being brave and loud about the value of their own lives and about their right and determination to be free. And my kids experienced adults and those same young people asking them about their signs, affirming them for making their voices heard. And all of that was both morally appropriate and correct for us to be there, but it was also powerful for their development. My kids' development specifically, they experienced having anti-racist agency. And that's how the story ended that day. But the middle part of the story is where I learned what it means to let my white kids have their hearts broken. I had walked downstairs where my children were making their signs to tell them it was time to go. And when I walked in the room, I literally caught my breath when I saw my older child's sign. My child was, I think, about 8 at the time. Her sign said this. It had green and red marker stars and hearts all over it. And it said in big letters, Black Lives Matter, M-A-T-E-R. They matter the same as white. Stop killing them. And then below that, my child had written the names of people in her life who she loves. Her sign said it this way: people that are Black are T, her cousin, A, her cousin, and Toby, her aunt, my sister-in-law. And I didn't just catch my breath. I literally felt my own heart shatter into about 1 million pieces. But what I remembered from that devastating but really gorgeous sign was that these are not days in which any of us dare live without a broken heart. If our hearts aren't broken right now, then we are lost already, because we've already lost too much of our own humanity. And so what I'm actually holding on to is another devastating but very beautiful recognition, and that's this. At that point, and still today, my 8-year-old is a whole, wonderful, smart, kind, beautiful, and very happy child. She doesn't wake up in despair about the world every morning. That's more likely to be her parents at this point. But she was already then, and still is, living with a broken heart. My partner and I never said to our 8-year-old, your aunt and your cousins are Black and police puts their lives in danger. We'd never been explicit in that way, though we'd always been race conscious in our parenting. But by that fall then, she'd hit an age where she could connect the dots in that explicit way. She understood that racism is a real thing with real consequences for real people. And so she knew that some of her most beloveds are among those people. And so she knew exactly what the stakes were at that protest. She knew why she wanted to be there. And the thing is, her heart was and is still exposed and young enough that she just put that right there on a sign. She named that pain out loud when she put her cousins' names on a sign. There's so much uncharted territory to raising white kids. Most of us have had few models if we are ourselves white. This is very scary. It is hard. But I'm very clear at this point that the most truthful questions about raising white kids for anti-racism, for racial justice, are not about how we exactly map or measure or get the perfect strategy to teach them about justice. The most truthful questions aren't the practical ones about how to do it just right. The most truthful questions have to do with whether or not we will choose to be brave. Raising white kids for justice, for racial justice, requires that we expose them to hard realities. It means we have to create space for them to move into their own relationship with injustice, to allow them to literally feel injustice, to touch it, to ache from its actual costs. And that is tough. And I get it, because it's a lot about letting our kids' hearts get broken. But I am convinced that this is the most life-affirming choice I could possibly make for my children, because it's the only way that white kids remain human enough to recognize and fight for the humanity of their fellow humans whose lives are actually at stake today, right now, all over the country, in this system we are all living in. And so with all the uncertainty, with the awkward, with the tears and the fears, we need to be courageous and emboldened together, because the lives and humanity of all of our children on this precious earth deserve nothing less. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I wish we were in an auditorium where you would hear the applause, but it'll just have to be virtual at this point.
Thank you, John.
If you have questions, again, direct them to libraryprogramquestions@gmail.com. That's library program questions as one word. So we'll start with questions that we have thus far. This one is, I live in a very white community, and my children go to an almost all 100% white school in the western suburbs. I'd love to engage with people of color to have conversation and learn, but not sure how to do so. Do you have suggestions or recommendations?
Yeah. So the truth is, and this question reflects the lots of white realities, because we live in a very segregated nation, and none of that segregation happened by itself. There were public policies that were made and choices that families have made. And so this is a real problem. There's a few things. One is that we can, all of us, and we must actually, right now, it's always been urgent, but it's particularly urgent. Engage media, books, films, written by, produced by, created by activists of color, scholars of color, fiction writers of color, because part of what we need to do to even be able to have a conversation across racial lines that doesn't potentially cause harm to the folks we want to engage with is to do some work to educate ourselves. And that can happen by engaging and supporting the resources that so many brilliant Americans, Black, Brown Americans, Asian Americans, African American people have produced for us to engage. So that's a starting point. The other thing I want to say is that even when we are in predominantly white spaces, race is present. And so it's actually a bit, I get the confusion, because I experience it sometimes too, but we can actually start talking about anti-racism, even if it's just white people, because racism is actually part of the culture that comes out of white communities, right? And so we can, start to talk, like with young kids, just sort of notice, if I'm engaging lots of media with my kids that's diverse, then an early development question is to get them noticing, why is it that so many of the shows we watch, there's, Black people and brown people and white people, but our classrooms are mostly white. What do you think that's about? And get our kids noticing their spaces are very white, right? And from there, as they age, we can start talking and teaching them about how did schools and neighborhoods end up so white, right? And so we build in this teaching. And the last thing I'll say is that sometimes we think that just diversity on its own will be better, right? And it's certainly true that many children do better, white children, I'm not sure always that children of color experience the benefits of it, but diversity does sort of give children a really critically important experience that we can build from. But diversity on its own, if there's white silence, doesn't actually accomplish, like you heard my teenager story in that high school. And so knowing that means, again, for those of us that have kids in spaces that are predominantly white, it means that it's not that diversity is what's missing. I mean, that is missing, but that wouldn't solve the problem, right? And so engaging with sources, and then also reading. Just today, Melody Taylor, who's a mom, an African-American mom who has children in Des Moines Public Schools, wrote an amazing piece about also, even in really good, well-intended, predominantly white spaces like a school, how kids of color even in white schools, there's always kids of color. Those families and those children need and deserve us advocating about how to also do a better job making sure our teachers are supported in teaching Black history, teaching what's going on in Latina communities, so that those kids don't go to a classroom where they never see themselves reflected in the curriculum.
The next question is, do you have tips for finding stories, examples of white heroes and sheroes that have worked for racial justice and equity?
Yes. Oh, and it's not here, it's at home, and I'm in my office, but this book, I'm sure there's more, but one of the best ones right now, or one of the best ones I've seen, it's called Not My Idea. And I think the second part of the title is like something about whiteness. Not My Idea. Go get that book, because what's brilliant about it, it's a kid's book. I've read it with my kids. We've read it many times. In addition to listing a lot of white anti-racist committed humans, which it is important we teach our kids about those folks, because we don't want them to look around and say, well, white people never ally and advocate with. There's always been a few, right? Teaching our kids that is not important because we want to overstate what white folks have done for racial justice. We are mostly a thin line in that story. But our kids need to see that that is a choice they can make. And so this book, Not My Idea, not only names a bunch of those folks, but also does a beautiful job of, through a kid's voice, talking about how this child is like, wait a second, but this wasn't my idea. I don't like this. I don't want this racist legacy to be my legacy. And so it does a really good job of engaging some of the real developmental challenges white children face when they come in through into awareness of diversity and racial justice, and go, okay, so I can't recommend that book enough. And I think more and more stuff is coming all the time. Ibram Kendi has a great book about, a kid's book now coming out about, just came out about anti-racism. And so the resources are endless. Just start to Google and you'll find so many.
Well, I'll point everyone to chat, as you might guess, with librarians on the call. They have pointed out that you can go to the catalogs of the area libraries, and the libraries have those books available. So we suggest you do that. In the current climate, how do you connect with those who don't accept the idea that there is white privilege and racism?
So that is hard for lots of reasons. It's contextual. So it depends a little bit on who it is and why and where they're coming from and what they say, right? So on the one hand, there are folks in our worlds that just want to shout and say, I don't believe this exists, and my reason for yelling that at you is just to try and make you feel bad or sad or threatened or whatever, right? And I deeply believe in trying to engage with folks who disagree with me, but I'm learning that if there's no sort of open willingness on the other side to have an exchange, then unless it's a family member, and this is different, I'm mostly not trying to put my energy there unless they're in my classroom. I'm committed to teaching all my students however they show up. But I'm more concerned about getting folks who are kind of intellectually aware or believe that we have a problem. My biggest concern is getting more of those folks to begin to activate, because if we did that, the influence and the impact of those that are saying this isn't a problem would be reduced. We would do more to move the needle on racial justice if we got the sort of folks who agree it's a problem to actually make some concrete commitments on a weekly basis, at least, right? Wherever you work, wherever you live, or in your school, whatever. And so I'm much more interested in engaging that conversation. But I do think that folks that, like in my family, where there's all kinds of thought patterns in my extended family, right? Being willing to engage in an ongoing conversation is critically important, because we all learn, if there's an openness to exchange. Like, I learned lots of the things I know now that I didn't believe these things in my late teens and early 20s. I learned them. And so continuing to talk, trying not to sort of preach at my family members or your family members, but trying to say, okay, can you give me an example of when a white person got discriminated against? That's real, one you actually know, because white people also, we get caught in these, well, I had a friend of a friend of a friend, and there's lots of studies that show that stuff's made up. But, you know, so that you can sometimes, you know, get into it if you can kind of say, or like, I'm wondering, you know, if there's some anger behind why you're insisting on saying that. And if you could talk to me what it is you feel angry about or afraid about, right? And then share some of your own fears, right? So sometimes we need to be willing to create and try and get a little vulnerability in our conversations. But again, that's in certain relationships. There's other spaces where that's not really safe to do or doesn't work. You know, it's got to be a longer term kind of thing. And then also maybe I'd just invite a family member or a friend, say, you know what, even if you don't agree with me, could we read this piece together that I found convincing? So I'd love to at least understand where it didn't convince you or what different take you have, just to keep a dialogue going. Because I think sometimes getting stuff on the table, if it's really being done in a good faith way, even when there's real disagreement, it can take a long time for change to occur, but I do think it can happen. And history is also some of the best ways to do it. Sometimes people are really insistent there's no such thing as racism or white privilege because they literally don't know their own history. And like if you live in Des Moines and you don't know what Center Street is, you might not believe that what happened to Black wealth in Des Moines. Well, the city eviscerated it in the 50s and 60s. There's folks still alive who went through that in our very own communities in Des Moines. And if you actually engage the history, it becomes really hard not to see that we have a crisis and that white Des Moinesites have an obligation to do something about that history. So those are some of my strategies, but it is a challenge, but we need to keep talking. Our own bubbles are not a solution either. We have to keep talking with folks who don't agree with us.
The next questioner asked about the consequences of pursuing this. They ask, do you feel safe in your private life, given the current climate and your positions?
I will just say this. There are people in this country who are daily experiencing and living risks and experiencing threats and have a visibility that leaves me in awe that they are continuing to do what they do. I think I'll leave I appreciate that question. I'll leave that response right there.
Probably the safe place to leave it.
Yeah.
In the midst of the COVID pandemic, what suggestions do you have for experiential learning opportunities for young preschool age children?
You know, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure I have a great answer in that my kids are a little older. I mean, they're 9 and 11. So, but my hunch is like, I think about, I don't know what all the libraries are doing virtually right now, but I'm sure they're doing amazing things. And I think about like programs I've been with my kids at Franklin Library, and I suspect, again, like local events like diversity in children or programming at a library, like looking through some of the, well, and now actually you can do national stuff, right? Sort of starting to Google like public library and, you know, Black history or public library and racial justice and see what comes up. I bet there's a plethora of preschool kinds of virtual opportunities right now, but I'm unable to name them, not because I don't care, but that's not where I'm mostly spending my time with my kids right now because of their age. But I bet they're out there. I'm sure they're out there. And if there's not, all the librarians on this call right now are going to plan some. So you'll be good.
I think you're right. If you could name a single thing educators in a predominantly white system can do to raise their students' racial awareness, what would it be?
I think the single most important thing in terms of teachers' opportunities would be to teach the truth about US American history. So for example, we should not be sending children home learning about someone like George Washington and never telling them that he enslaved people of African descent for a number of reasons. One, if there are kids of color in that class, Black kids, they know, right? Most of the times their families are teaching them that real history. So there's a harm that gets caused to them. Also, a harm gets caused to white kids because they end up having this mythologized view of US American history. And then when they do start to learn about enslavement, it takes a long time, unless someone explicitly puts the pieces together. White kids will develop this like, oh, we had slavery, that was really bad. But they never realize it's people we make as heroes that like built that structure. So they have them in like two separate silos. That is intellectually a problem. It's also a real moral cognitive dissonance. And so when I think about, for example, teaching history accurately, it's not that I want to demonize any ancestor, right? But I want kids to be offered the incredible opportunity to wrestle with moral questions. So for example, when my second grader was loving up on George Washington all the time, and after I thought about a thoughtful way to do it, but we ended up in this amazing conversation where I burst the bubble to her that he had enslaved people. We had this amazing conversation. I mean, first she asked me like, why are they teaching me that he's a hero then? And she was really hurt because she loves her teachers, right? And so she was like, why did they do that? And I said, well, why? I think white people have a hard time to talk about that. Why do you think that might be? And she was like, oh, I bet it's hard to admit because it makes us feel bad, right? And we had this amazing conversation. And I talked with my younger child the other day about, and with the suffragettes, about the white supremacy of the suffragettes. And I said to my kid, who's 9, how do you think we should remember these women who were really amazing and who were also really racist? Like, how should we talk about that? And it was a really important moral development conversation. I don't even know the right answer, but I know we shouldn't lie about history. And so I think that's the number one thing teachers could do. Because the other thing why that's so transformative is not only is it better for kids intellectually and morally, you also, teachers understandably really fear white backlash from white parents. If you're teaching history truthfully, you're on solid ground. You can't be told you're indoctrinating. You're just teaching the truth of our history, right? So I think that might be, again, there might be other things folks might disagree that would be more important, but I think that's one of the big ones because that's certainly where I've seen the most important transformation in my own children in the way they see the world is when we give them a fuller, truthful accounting of history.
Good. How do we as white parents respond when our children express gratitude for being white? You mentioned that a little bit earlier.
So that's a really good question. I think typically, I don't always do this, as my kids will tell you, but when hard questions like that come up, I think one of the best things to do is to start by asking them a bunch of questions. What are you feeling grateful about? What about being white makes you feel grateful? And then maybe my kid says something like, maybe they've internalized some racist ideas, right? And they said something like, well, I just think white people are prettier or more handsome. What if they say something like that? Like, oh my God, I'm horrified my kid thinks that. Oh, thank God. You just had this conversation. You got that in the air. You can engage it over time, right? As opposed to them internalizing it and you haven't even known that's what they're thinking. And so with something like that, then you start to go, wow, depending on their age, I'm really surprised to hear you say that because I think all these person and this person is beautiful and handsome. Or maybe, wow, I wonder how so-and-so who's in your life and who you adore would feel if they heard you say that. Like, but not in a, like, the number one thing we need to do is not shut our kids down because then it just will go on without us having access to it. Or maybe they'll say, well, I'm grateful for that because I saw what happened in the civil rights movement and that was really scary for Black people. Then it's like, yeah, that is really scary. And we've been talking about this kind of thing still going on. Black people, Black communities are still struggling to achieve full justice and equality. And, I'm also glad that I feel sometimes grateful too, that I'm not, experiencing injustice, but it makes me and our family then want to work even harder to make sure everybody gets to experience that because we want everyone to experience safety and justice. And so that can become a really powerful opportunity to remind our kids of what our values are as a family, right? And so I think asking questions is a great way to start, not freaking out, not being like, oh my God, my kid's a white supremacist, right? Another reason to start it early because kids do get more fixed in their notions the older they get. But questions. more important to keep the conversation going than it is to be right or convince them of your view or whatever. Keep a conversation going and be modeling it yourself. Those two things I think are the most important, even when our kids ask a really freaky question like that. And then also be grateful they asked you at home and didn't say that out loud in a public space where they really might hurt someone, right?
The next question is a two-parter. One, what prompted you to write your most recent book, and how long did it take?
So I've been involved in various forms of multiracial activism, or at least like anti-racism, for almost 30 years. And have in that time done that in a way that people of color in my life charged and challenged me to figure out what the white part meant for me, especially in my 20s and early 30s. Especially African-American people in my life were like, look, great, good for you that you care about racial justice, like, but you're white, so you can't just run around being like, you're different than all the other white people, and really held my feet to the fire in a way that I didn't always love, but boy, changed my life in powerful, liberating ways. So I had been doing that from my late 20s until my mid 40s. And then when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, I was in a lot of predominantly white spaces and multiracial spaces, but churches in particular would ask me to come talk about my prior book. And a lot of those, and it just happened to be out about the time that youth in Ferguson were resisting so powerfully. And adults in those spaces started saying to me, as I talked about white obligation in the face of police brutality, saying, okay, yes, and how should I be talking about this with my kids? And I was like, oh gosh, how am I talking about it with my kids? Like, my kids were, 3 and 5 at the time. Am I talking about this with my kids? And what does that look like? How should we be? And I realized I didn't really know. I mean, I knew I was doing some things because I've been always engaged in activism. I would take my kids along with me, but I hadn't thought about it. So I was just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And then I also realized that a couple times then things happened in that time where I tell a story in the book about one of my kids singing One Little, Two Little, Three Little Indians, that song, and me realizing, oh my God, and not knowing what to say to her. And here I had been doing, at that point I'd written 3 books on anti-racism, and I didn't know how to engage my 3-year-old, right? So I just realized that A, I needed to think about what I was doing. B, I looked around and there were really no other resources. There's lots about what kids of color need and deserve, appropriately so. That's the first point of response we should be worried about and attending to. But white kids' journey is different because they are the beneficiaries of the injustice, right? And so we can't teach it in the same way. It's different when you're teaching a Black or brown child how to be proud of their identity in order to survive racism, right? And thrive. You can't teach that to a white kid in the same, it's just different. So, and there was just nothing. And so I realized I had to be willing to be a little vulnerable. How long did it take me to write it? I don't know. I think I wrote it in about a year, but I didn't write it from scratch in a year because I had been involved in anti-racism work for long enough, and I had been steeped in white racial identity development theory for a long time because I tried to understand my own journey and had worked with white adults, that I was not starting from, ground zero, because I already knew some things about what happens in white people's lives. I just suddenly went, oh, white guilt, when it shows up in people's 20s, what'd be really cool is if we got kids through it before they are 20s. So instead of wallowing in white guilt as an adult, if I can journey my child through white guilt as a 7-year-old, so she's ready to just be in solidarity with communities of color, I think we could do that, right? So that's kind of how it happened. So I'm not a psychologist and I don't know anything about kids except I'm a mom.
Next question is, what 2 or 3 actions would you recommend for white allies to engage in here in Des Moines to address anti-racism? 2 or 3 actions.
number one thing right now, always, but especially right now, plug in with a Black or Brown-led organization in Des Moines for a number of reasons. One, those leaders in our own community are literally on the front lines right now in the middle of a pandemic, fighting for their families' lives, leading and being, it's true, being threatened and receiving white backlash at the hands of the state. And so if we are wanting to be allies, which has got to be a verb, it's not a noun, number one thing is plug in with one of those organizations. So maybe for you, that means if you're not going in public spaces, maybe it's resources, or maybe it's looking at their calls to action. And if you can't show up physically, it's, writing the letters they're asking folks to write, right? But instead of just individual actions, we need to, number one, be supporting people of color-led organizations right here in Iowa right now. Number two, I would say would be to make a commitment, or kind of, I like to do a life scan. I'm like, okay, none of us can do all of the things, and it can be really overwhelming, especially when there's fires everywhere right now, to think about what can I do? It's just all so big. And so in my life, it's been really helpful to say, okay, there's 24 hours in a day, there's 7 days in a week. I know I have to do the X number of things, sleep, feed, eat, feed my kids, all that good stuff. With the hours that I tend to devote to some sort of civic engagement, what am I doing with it? Like, what am I doing at my workplace right now to look around and see what people of color in my workplace are saying about the racial climate at Drake University? Is there at least one thing I'm plugged into with others, preferably, that I could say, if someone came to me and said, hey, you want to be an ally, what are you actually doing? I could say, well, I'm not doing all the things, but right now at Drake, I'm working on this, right? And right now at my kid's school, I'm working on this. And so, it's like an hour, literally, what is it? If you have 1 hour a week to do civic engagement or volunteer somewhere, where are you putting it? And I think white families, especially middle to upper middle class white families who have resources, really, we need to be thinking, how often am I volunteering at my kid's school, right? When my kid's probably going to be fine. When hours are limited, I should be spending that hour in another way, resourcing a justice organization in some way, and thinking differently about volunteering. So kind of a life scan is one thing. So you can sort of get real with yourself. Like, where am I making this a priority? Because it doesn't happen by itself. And then the last thing I would say is to start really prioritizing engaging media, books, and other kinds of art and literature written by people of color. I sometimes, it's like arbitrary, but I'm like, if I get 85% of my news from journalists of color, I'm going to have a much better idea what's going on in the country than if I read 85% white journalists. And we have some amazing leaders in this country right now. And it changes how you see things when you just start to say, I'm going to center the voices of people of color in how I interpret reality. That is also, I think, number three of those three things. I think those are the three things I think feel, to me right now, the most urgent, because that third one will also create long-term consciousness change in your own life, and then also in the way you feel equipped to talk to the other people in your life, including your own children. If you're starting to really, it's sort of like, it takes a while to relearn lots of the ways we've been socialized as white people, but it happens. But it doesn't happen by magic or accident or osmosis. You have to decide, I'm going to make this a priority, because segregation just does work on its own if we don't actively choose against it.
Now, you may not want to answer this, but as far as voting goes, we hear a lot today about advocacy for voting for candidates to support one's position. Do you see that on your spectrum of things that you would recommend?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. I mean, right now, we have to be supporting and working with communities of color who are raising alarm bells about voter suppression, figuring out where we can be plugging in to help get out the vote, because literally people of color are experiencing terror in this country right now. And so we have to, yes, thank you for, I mean, the next 10 weeks, and this isn't me stomping for the Democrats. I get all the critique, like whatever, but there is a crisis of epic proportions if we reelect no, both, you know, the national leader, but that also has implications down the ticket. So people of color are talking about voter suppression and organizing against it. And again, resourcing those organizations and helping get out the vote, especially in a swing state like Iowa, which also means we should be talking to our family members. White folks got to talk to our family members. We got to stop like yelling into like social media voids, like get out the vote. We need to literally be going to our neighbors and having hard conversations and saying to them, can we talk about what happened in Kenosha? Because white folks are going to be very seduced by the law and order rhetoric that's coming out of the White House right now. And other white folks who know the stakes and who can, like, we've got to break silence and be like, hey, I'm not going to play political don't ask, don't tell right now. I need to have conversations with my neighbors, with my family members who I know have been poised to vote a certain way come November, but who now might be going, oh, but we need to talk to those folks and not just let that silence it kind of erode on its own, because that could be catastrophic. So organizations that are, you know, working against voter suppression, and literally in swing states, one-on-one conversations with other white folks in our life who we think might be tempted to vote for someone who would, I'll just leave it there. You know what I'm talking about.
As a white person, how do you open conversation about racial issues with a Black friend? That's an awkward thing for some people.
Yeah, you know, I appreciate that question a lot. And it's hard to answer because it's also very contextual. And it's really hard right now. This is a hard moment to open a conversation about racial issues with a Black friend if you've never done it before, because the level of exhaustion and sadness, like grief, bone-weary grief and outrage in Black and brown communities right now, there's no words for what it's at. And so if you've never done that before, it can be that trying to do that now actually causes a reaction and an experience of pain for that person that is, you know, I don't know that it's always the right thing to do. And it might, and actually, if they're really your friend and you haven't talked about it yet, it might be that your experience of the friendship is different than theirs. I don't know, but so I would say, basically I'm just describing what is just a hard reality. So it depends. I will say that one of the best things we can do to make it more likely that we can engage in conversations about race and racism with people of color in our lives who we care about is to be ourselves actively engaged in some activated way against racism, because then the likelihood that if I reach out or if I try to offer some care and support verbally around what people might be experiencing, it's less likely to be experienced as like, oh, I'm trying to like make them feel better, you know, because what people of color say they need right now is they need white folks to get out of our heads and into organizing with them. And so the last thing I'll say about that is that one of the things I tried to do, and it's not necessarily the right thing to do. I wrestled with this myself in some of my relationships, even though talking about race is not new for me in my relationships with people of color in my life. But I too, as each sort of next, you know, horrifying violence has happened, have been like, okay, I want to reach out and offer words of support. They also feel empty. What do I do? You know, a couple of friends who I thought it would not feel invasive, I just say, hey, you know, could I bring you would it be helpful to you if I dropped you off some food? Like, could I bring you some food, love, and just drop it out? You don't even have to talk to me or see me. Could I bring you some food? I know it's a lot. You know, and a couple of people in my life were like, yeah, that'd be great. And a couple of people were like, no, I'm good, thanks. You know, so those are some of the things to think about in regard to that question. It's an important question. And I think it raises for any of us and should raise the bigger question of what am I doing to make this country safer for that friend who I care about? That's the prior question, I think. if we hope to be able to have conversations with African American people and Latinx peoples in our lives.
Do you think universities are doing enough to address race awareness in their training of pre-service student teachers?
Big capital N, big capital O, period. No, I mean, no.
What more should they be doing?
Well, I mean,
where do you start?
Oh my, well, yeah, I mean, like, so, I mean, the challenge is, and this is part of why I feel really deep empathy for teachers, and especially I have a deep love for public school teachers who do so much and are amazing. And they were amazing before this pandemic. And now they're like, so I feel like they've been underserved by teacher education, because what we need to be doing is not thinking one class in teacher ed about cultural proficiency, right? Which my whole talk also lays bare why even talking about cultural proficiency doesn't begin to get at then the problem of whiteness, right? So if we have a predominantly white teaching population who has the same fears that I just described in my talk, was raised in a kind of so-called colorblind mode, it's developmentally predictable that teachers are going to struggle when my nephew says, let's play racially divided dodgeball, right? And so teachers, pre-service education needs to be first, at very least in terms of the curriculum, in addition to cultural proficiency, which is important because teaching about whiteness and anti-racism is only one stem. We also have to actively teach folks about, Black history and histories of immigrant communities. So it's like, here's the anti and here's the pro, because kids of color in the classroom, as Melody Taylor's piece reminded me today, also have profound needs and deserve to see themselves in the curriculum. There needs to just be so many more course offerings, because it's literally pedagogically irresponsible to not up the number of course offerings and then send white teachers into a school district that has 40% kids of color. Everyone's going to be harmed in that scenario. The other thing is that we need to do is that help all teachers understand that this is a developmental problem. It's not only about content. And so racial identity development, which is something that all of us experience if we live in a racialized society, which anyone in the United States does, that is a phenomena. And so white teachers need to be steeped in and supported in inquiry into their own racial identity development, because awareness of that, and that's something we could do in teacher prep, right? Awareness of your own development, you can actually, like other forms of growth, you can actually learn about it and help yourself grow capacity. And instead of teachers individually trying to figure that out while they're also teaching 35 children and 5 days a week, and now in a pandemic, right? In teachers' education cohorts, we could be doing that work with them in schools. But part of the reason I was like, is that it's a bigger problem, because of course the Board of Ed has to sort of say, well, this matters for your accreditation. And, a school on its own, like Drake, isn't going to just decide, okay, well, you're going to be required all these more classes, because they also have to meet what the state says. So it's both a political organizing problem. We got to make the state change its requirements, and then we've got to, which will help the schools offer teachers what they need and deserve. And we should all be helping grow a pipeline for more teachers of color to actually want to be in education and stay in it, which they need to be treated well to do that, right? And so that's another layer of the crisis, is we also should have more Black and brown teachers, and we could do that if we had the political will and the will to sort of invest resources in that too. So it's a big, hard problem, but it's also urgent.
We have a question. Would it be valuable to have Black art and history in white homes, e.g. Black art on the walls, books about Black history, etc.? Or is this perhaps nearly meaningless, and are there better ways to create anti-racist kids?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's a lot of studies that show, and this isn't just about Black art, but that making sure our kids are exposed to diversity. So art would be one example, but in media, in books, with toys, all of those things. If you don't actively talk about it and engage in, you know, conversations about racism with them, in and of itself, that doesn't accomplish anything for anti-racism. And so there's been studies of this, and some of them are cited in my book, that it's just not enough. And it's also a little bit, to me, we have to be careful. I deeply believe in supporting, resourcing, paying for, you know, art, books, etc., produced by communities of color, like having lots of that in my children's lives. But we can't just like buy Black art, you know, art from Black people and put that all in our walls and not talk about it without for sure then slipping into kind of an appropriation that's like, okay, so why do you have that? Because it's a product, it's not actually part of your meaningful, the way you're living in the world. And so there's no like one right answer to this good question, but there is something for me about, yes, we should support and keep lots of diverse forms of art, et cetera, in our lives. But we also still need to be talking about anti-racist whiteness, because that in of itself won't do the work. And we need to be very careful that that doesn't become a way like, oh, look, I've got Black art. But when, you know, young people in Des Moines, young Black leaders are in the streets, I'm not actively resourcing them while they're literally, you know, trying to, you know, secure their freedom and liberation. And so we have to be careful that we don't just choose that, because that's kind of an easy form of consumption. And we have to activate in solidarity with Black and brown communities while we are also valuing their art and their writing and all kinds of things.
We're almost at the 8 o'clock hour. What would be your parting words? What takeaways do you want people to leave this evening with?
One takeaway: don't get so freaked out that you don't have the right words, that you don't have the conversation. Our kids can handle it. If we tell them something, we don't say it right, and we totally screw it up, most of the time we get to come back tomorrow and say, hey, I didn't like the answer I gave you, and actually I didn't even know enough to answer it, so I went and educated myself, which also it's good for our kids to see white humility, because white people need more of that around racial learning. And so don't think that just by avoiding it, that's less risky, it's not going to backfire. Silence is going to backfire much worse than some of, yes, the hard messiness that comes up when we start talking with our children about race. It's gonna be messy, and you're gonna say things you regret, and you're gonna get things wrong. I've done it a million times, I'll do it again tomorrow. Do not let that stop you, because it's better to have that conversation. The other thing is that for most white adults, we are having to relearn or learn for the first time things that we are wanting to teach our kids. And that is one of the ways our experiences is typically different than Black and brown parents, who more often did get the teaching they needed and deserved from their elders, their parents, their grandparents. And so there's a reason this feels hard, and it's not because you're a bad person. It's because you probably didn't get the mentoring you needed and deserved too. And so you are making a choice right now to give to your child something that you also deserved, and that Black and brown communities definitely deserved for you to get. And so it's a life-giving, liberative commitment to do this hard and messy thing. And I'm seeing people all over the state of Iowa stand up in ways I never have before. And I do believe, as hard as everything is right now and as scary as things are, that if more of us who are white just decide the awkward and the mess and the discomfort is like totally worth it, because people of color's lives are actually at stake. And when you do awkward, uncomfortable things, the third or fourth time you do them, it stops feeling so uncomfortable. So just do it, and find others to do it with, because we can change the world if we decide to do it. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thanks, John. Have a great rest of your night.
You too. Thank you all for being here for the program. I do want to again thank all of our hosts, Des Moines Public Library, West Des Moines Public Library, Clive Public Library, and Beaverdale Books, which again has signed copies of Dr. Harvey's book available for sale, with a portion of the proceeds going to Urban Dreams. We also had support this evening from the Friends of the Forest Avenue Library and the Friends of the Franklin Avenue Library. That concludes our program this evening. Thank you very much. And again, as I mentioned from the beginning, if you take a look at cnn.com and enter Jennifer Harvey, you'll see the article that she posted today as well as some of her prior ones. Thank you all for being here.